Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Katie and I'll be your host for today's webinar. This is part 2 of our Transformation Heroes series. Today we'll be talking about mastering transformation, essential skills for change management. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Melody Helkowski. She is one of Shibumi's value delivery managers, and she is also a certified change practitioner. I'll let Melody take it from here, so let's begin.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. As Katie mentioned, my name is Melody Helkowski, and I'm a value delivery manager at Shibumi. For just a little bit of background on our value delivery team at Shibumi and what we're focused on, we are, often working with customers who are embarking on some sort of transformation journey. And we work with those customers really to make sure that those transformations are successful. Oftentimes, that means we're running workshops with customers to map out the outcomes that they're looking to achieve in their transformation efforts and building plans to work towards achieving those outcomes. And then we also help them to take those requirements and build them into the Shibumi platform as they are working towards executing on their transformations. So we had a webinar in December. As Katie mentioned, this is a series, so our Transformation Heroes series. And our webinar in December went into more depth about our value delivery framework and, mapping out those outcomes with our customers. So if you're interested in that topic, definitely reach out and we can point you in the right direction. But for today, we will be focused on change management and, how change management can also impact transformations and why it's such an important element. Just for a little bit more background on myself, I've worked in technology consulting for about 8 years now, and I've seen a lot of clients undergo large transformation efforts, whether related to digital transformation, cost transformation, etc. And I'm also a certified change practitioner with ProSci, which is one of the leading change management methodologies. So I'm often pulling from my change management background to help customers understand how they can most successfully implement change, especially with large transformations and really just in this day and age where change is constant. So to dive into what we'll be discussing today, I'll be focusing on how change management can be used to achieve successful transformation. We'll talk about what change management is, why it's important, how we at Shibumi specifically think about change management and the approach that we've developed. And then I will walk through some steps to execute on a change management strategy that hopefully, you can take with you as you're thinking about change management within your organization. And I'll talk about all of this in the frame of an example situation, just to kind of make it a little bit more real for everyone. So the situation is going to be about Acme Corp. They are a global technology company that's been in business for 25 years, and they're always undergoing transformation. So they know that it's a constant for them. And these transformations really vary in terms of their focus. Some are, cost related, innovation related, etc. And like I said, we'll use that situation to walk through how they can make sure that their transformations are successful. One other thing I want to mention before we jump into more of the details is that we at Shibumi work with our customers to, help them implement change management strategies specifically for their implementations of the Shibumi platform. So everything that you hear today are things that, we actually work with our customers on as they're implementing our applications. But the tools and frameworks that I walk through can also be applied to other change situations outside of just implementing a new platform. So with that, I'll go ahead and jump in and really just start with some background on what change management is. Some people have their own definitions for this or different definitions for this. But when I talk about change management, really what I'm referring to is a discipline that guides the management of the people side of change. So it's all about the people when I'm talking about change management. And really how those individuals need to change as a result of whatever is going on within their organization. So change management focuses on preparing those individuals to successfully adopt changes and transition from whatever their current state is to what the future state is going to be. Another thing that I always think is important to mention when it comes to change management is that it is more than just communications. So often when people hear change management, communications is something that comes to mind, and that's absolutely right. Communication is an important part of change management, but it's not everything. And as I get into more of the details today of the steps to execute on a change management strategy, you'll see that change management requires assessment, planning, communications, training, and also reinforcement to make sure that the change sticks. And then the last thing that I'll mention is that change management can occur at a project level, but it can also occur at an organizational level. So at a project level, change management is all about applying, a structure, a process, tools to achieve the desired outcomes of the project when you think about those people needing to move from their current state to the future state. And at an organizational level, change management is really a competency for enabling change within an entire organization and increasing that organization's capability to change. So why does all of this matter? Why is change management important? I think there's a lot of reasons why change management should be top of mind, especially for transformation leaders. And some of the reason for that is that change management can help drive greater benefit realization and achievement of results and outcomes. So it's great to want to make a change, but that change is really only as good as the adoption that comes with it and the people moving along their change journey to be able to achieve the results that you're looking for. Another reason why change management is really important is that if change is managed poorly, that can oftentimes lead to additional costs, which, of course, you want to avoid as much as possible. Some of those costs might come from rework, having to redo things if the people don't end up adopting in the way that you want them to. Change management also helps changes be adopted more consistently, completely, and proficiently. So if you think about it, people are always going to do things a little bit differently in their own way, but by applying a structure and a process, you make it so that people are hearing the same things and really going along for the same journey so that the change can be adopted in a more similar way throughout the organization. And then lastly, building that organizational change capability, as I mentioned for Acme Corp, and as for many other organizations these days, change is constant. And so the more that you do this change management, the more that the organization will kind of get used to that structure, used to that process, and be able to apply that moving forward. So all of this is really important for transformation leaders because they need to make sure that individuals are on board with the transformation efforts that they're leading, ready to adopt so that they can achieve the results that they're looking for and avoid any of the costs and risks of mismanaged change. Okay, so a little bit about how we at Shibumi think about change management and the specific approaches that we use when we're working with our customers. So we are focused on ensuring end user adoption, specifically of the strategic portfolio management tools and processes that we provide. And we use the ProSci methodology to do that. As I mentioned, I'm a certified change practitioner with ProSci, and what that provides is a structured, repeatable approach. However, we also know that every organization is a little bit different and are going to have their own nuances and unique things about them. So even though we do base our approach in ProSci, we tailor that to the organizations that we work with and their unique needs. So, those unique needs may be based on their culture, maturity, the level of change that's being implemented. But, we don't just apply a one-size-fits-all approach. We're focused on driving value. So this kind of ties back to our value delivery framework and the webinar that I mentioned that we led last month. But we always want to keep the end business goals in mind and help drive our customers towards reaching those end business goals. And then lastly, we know that change management doesn't stop at launch. So again, whether this is launching a new system, launching a new process, monitoring and iteration is really important to make sure that there's continual improvements and just that overall reinforcement of a change. So these are the pillars that we use as we're working with our customers to manage the change of implementing a strategic portfolio management tool. But I think these pillars can ring true when managing any type of change as well. Okay, so let's get into some more specifics around a change management process and what are some of the key things that need to happen as a part of change management activities. So the first thing that I always like to highlight is that anytime you are thinking about a change, so Acme Corp, for example, and all of the transformations that they're undergoing, you really need to take some time to assess what's happening. Who are the people that are going to be impacted? To what level are they going to be impacted? Who are the people that can help support us on this journey that we're going to go on? So it's always tempting to jump right in, start building communication, start building training. But I think it's important to take that time up front to make sure that you have a really good understanding of what are the changes that are going on, to then feed into those detailed communication and training plans and all of the different materials that you're going to have to build as you move forward into execution. So in the assess phase, some of the activities that typically happen are, as I mentioned, identifying stakeholders impacted by the change, assessing the level of change, identifying executives who are going to be able to support you along the way, or whether that's a steer co or some other leadership group, as well as change champions, or if it's a technology super users who are going to be able to work with you throughout the change management process. After you have done that assessment, that really gives you the information to put together a fully fledged change management plan. So this is where things like a communication plan and a training plan would come into play, where you could map out, these are the things that we plan on communicating, and this is the timing associated with that. Same thing for training. Here is where you would also likely want to engage those change champions, super users, etc., to make sure that they're involved in the planning process and have some key things that they're going to be responsible for throughout the change management process as well. And lastly, identifying key adoption metrics. So with change management, really like any project, you want to make sure that you have an eye towards how do we know if this is successful, and being able to measure that. So identifying those metrics that you're going to track over time will help you gauge how your change management process is going, and whether you need to make any adjustments. After developing that plan, moving on to a build phase where you would actually build the communication and training content to be distributed. And that leads us into execution, where we start actually launching those materials and elements, holding training sessions, holding steerco meetings, and leveraging our change champion or super user group or network to provide coaching along the way, share stories, testimonials, to help bring others along for the change. And then monitoring and reinforcement is the last stage. So as I mentioned earlier in our Shibumi's pillars for change management, it doesn't just stop at launch, right? So monitoring things like usage or behavior change, making sure to get feedback from the people who are impacted by the change to see how they're doing, will allow you to take that information and then use it to update any of your ongoing plans. So maybe you need to have some refresher trainings or communicate about some of the new things that are upcoming as a result of the change. And then, measuring progress against those key adoption metrics that I mentioned earlier, to make sure that, you have a sense for the success of how things are going. All right. So with some of that background, I thought it would be a good time to pause and ask a poll question. So if you think about your organization and the change management practices that are being used, do you feel that there is a significant focus on change management, some focus but not consistently, or is there little focus on change management? So we'll pause here for a couple minutes and let you respond to the poll.
Okay, so far we have some answers in all three, but 50% say there is some focus on change management, but not consistently. And then about 33% say there is significant focus on change management for transformation efforts and projects, and about 16% saying there's little focus on change management.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad to see that this group definitely seems to skew more towards there being significant focus. I do think that, change management as a practice has become something that more, people and leaders in general have started to kind of keep an eye towards. So, I think it makes sense that that's where we saw the poll results end up. But for those of you who say there's some focus on change management, but not consistently, I think this is an opportunity to maybe take some of these learnings and then see how they could fit within your organization. And of course, we're always open to conversation about how we can help with that as well. So thanks to everyone for responding to the poll. Okay, so I just walked through 5 stages for how to go about, implementing a change management strategy. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail in each of those stages and talk more about, when you're conducting an assessment, what might that end up looking like? When you're putting together a communication or training plan, what might that look like? And these are examples that, we at Shibumi use, again, when we're working with our customers, and that I've seen, be used elsewhere as well as kind of common best practices. So hopefully sharing this with you all, provide some maybe ideas for how you can bring this forward in your organization. So starting with the assess phase, I'm going to talk about a change impact assessment. That's where I was talking earlier about how you want to make sure that you understand who are the individuals that are impacted by whatever change is going on within your organization, and helping to prepare them for it. So the reason why this is important is because if you think about a change, usually the biggest challenge is you have some organizational change. So an organization is moving from a current state to a future state, but really that needs to be translated into an individual level. So an organization is made up of individuals, and those individuals are also going to need to move from a current state to a future state. And to figure out, what's going on with those individuals, how are they affected, you need to look at some different aspects of their day-to-day. Some common ones might be the systems and tools that they're using, their roles and responsibilities, their processes, maybe just their overall mindsets or the way that they think about things, and break that down at a detailed level to understand, what is their current state and what is their future state going to look like. So here is an example for Acme Corp again. And with the transformations that Acme Corp is undertaking, they needed to first identify who are the stakeholder groups that were going to be impacted by these changes. And they had identified that they have initiative owners, initiative team members, program managers, and also executives and leaders who were going to be impacted by, the transformation that they're undertaking. So after identifying those different stakeholder groups, they also wanted to understand what level of influence do those different stakeholder groups have over making the change successful. There's always going to be some groups of stakeholders who have a higher level of influence and some who don't have quite as much, either because of their level within the organization or just their general role. And there's also likely always going to be detractors as well as promoters of the change. So that's something to try to keep an eye on from the very beginning, because those detractors are people that you're going to want to kind of try to switch over to that promoter side of things. So in this case, program managers and executives and leaders are going to have a higher level of influence to make the change successful. And the good news is that they are already promoters of the change. Whereas initiative owners and initiative team members have a little bit lower influence, and there also are detractors. So those are some of the people that, throughout the change management journey, we're going to have to try to kind of switch over to the other side. One thing I also want to mention here, just around change champions, which I called out earlier as something that you want to start to identify early on, is that stakeholder mapping exercise that I just walked through can help you identify some of your change champions. Because if you have people that are promoters that are influential within the organization, they're going to be some great people to leverage in this way. So when I think about change champions, you want to think about what are they going to be responsible for as a change champion, but also what are their qualifications. So some of the responsibilities of a change champion are advocating for adoption. They're going to be those people who can promote buy-in, teamwork, and collaboration. And really, in order to do that, they need to demonstrate leadership skills and be seen as kind of like a go-to person within the organization. They also are responsible for connecting with others. So typically, they're helping to gather feedback and really enable that culture of change. And in order to do that, they need to be respected and trusted, at a certain extent by leaders, peers, people who report to them, etc. They will definitely play a part in communication. So with impacted stakeholders, with, project teams, change champions can often be the people who are helping to actually distribute or send out messaging. And qualification for that is usually a person who speaks up for what they believe in and can effectively control that delivery of messaging. And then lastly, they need to make sure they understand the goals of the organization and the solution that's being put in place. And they will likely end up being an early adopter, or, I mentioned the term super user earlier. They might fall into that type of, role of a person. And they're really interested in the success of the change. All right, so pivoting from change champions and going back to the change impact assessment, we had shown the stakeholder map just a couple of slides back. This is the next step to get a little bit more deep into that. And as I mentioned, you want to be able to take each of those impacted groups and look at how their day-to-day is going to be changing in a couple of different aspects: processes, systems and tools, roles and responsibilities, mindsets. There could be other aspects as well. Those are just some of the common ones. And for this example, Acme Corp, they conducted this exercise for their initiative owners and program managers. They would conduct this exercise for all of their other impacted stakeholder groups as well. These are just the two that I'm showing for right now. And you can see that for initiative owners, in pretty much all of these categories, they will end up having a high level of impact. Their current state to future state is going to be changing significantly. And so, they're going to have a lot of change going on. Whereas the program managers, they're leaning a little bit more to that like medium side of change, where their systems and tools, responsibilities, mindsets, processes, there's going to be some change, but it's not quite as much as the initiative owners, for example. So this is where we get into that next level of detail. And then taking that allows you to put together a heat map for each of your impacted stakeholder groups. What's their overall impact? So you kind of want to get an understanding of, out of all of our impacted stakeholder groups, where is there going to be the most change versus the least change? And that's going to help you determine, where is your time and effort going to need to be spent from a change management perspective when it comes to that communication, training, overall engagement. So again, in this example here, as we just mentioned, the initiative owners are going to be the highest impacted group. We have some medium impacted groups in our program managers and leaders, and then we have team members, and then just some other groups that have a pretty low impact. So the last piece of the change impact assessment is using all of that information and, as I mentioned, using it to figure out where are you going to need to engage the most. So those who have, this is a kind of a 4-square quadrant just to make it really easy and simple to map out who needs what, is what I usually call it. So if the level of impact is high and the level of influence of the person is high, that means you're going to want to manage them the most thoroughly. In our example here, those initiative owners and program managers fall into that bucket. If the level of impact is high, but their influence maybe isn't as high, you're still going to want to engage with them, but they might just need to be on a more informed basis. If both the level of impact and level of influence is low, those are the people that you're not going to need to engage much. And so you might have minimal contact with them. For Acme Corp, that's going to be IT. IT is going to be, somewhat involved in the change, have some very slight impacts, but nothing that means they're going to need significant training or significant communication. And then lastly, if their influence is high, but their level of impact is relatively low, you still want to be able to meet their needs and kind of anticipate that, but you're not going to have to manage them quite as thoroughly. Okay, so that's everything for the change impact assessment, and really wraps up the assess stage. So now that you have all that information mapped out, this is where you get into more of a planning phase. And for the planning phase, I wanted to bring up this one ProSci specific framework that, if you're familiar with change management at all, you may have heard of it because it's a really common one that people always refer to. It's the ADKAR framework. And these are basically, building blocks or stepping stones for when you're actually going to execute upon a change management strategy. What are the building blocks that you need to put in place in order to make sure that the change is successful for people? So the first piece of ADKAR is awareness. People need to be aware of the need to change. So this is where you want to kind of build that overall, familiarity with the fact that a change is coming and why it's important. Often this is done with executive or leadership type of communications. Then from there, the next building block is you need to appeal to people's desire to change. So it's one thing for them to be aware of the change. It's a totally different thing for them to actually want to change. And desire comes into play with what's in it for me messaging is usually the way that this is achieved. So communicating specifically to each impacted stakeholder group, what's in it for them, why does this matter to them? Why is this a good thing for them? And this is a great opportunity to leverage change champions to be able to provide that sort of messaging. From there, moving on to knowledge. So this is how they're actually going to change. This is where training and education comes into play. Then ability. Ability and knowledge, I would say, go together, but training is usually not going to encompass everything, right? So there might need to be additional coaching, collecting feedback to really bridge the gaps that training wasn't able to fulfill. And then lastly, reinforcement, which I know I've mentioned many times throughout today, so clearly it's an important piece, but monitoring, measuring, and implementing additional change strategies as needed. So that's the ADKAR framework. And then this is something that you can bring into all of your change management planning. And I'll show that in this example here for a communication and training plan, for example. I think this is pretty straightforward by way of mapping out, what are the communications that we want to send out? What are the trainings that we want to do? What's the timing for that? But also, which ADKAR stage do these map to? So, for example, your introductory communications, like an executive introductory email or a town hall presentation, those really align to the awareness piece of ADKAR, just initially getting people familiar with the fact that the change is coming. Then providing some messaging with the what's in it for me. That's where you'll get to that desire piece. Providing FAQs and, of course, trainings is where knowledge will come into play, and, et cetera, et cetera. I won't talk through every line item here, but these are example communication and training plans that we at Shibumi use as we are working with our customers to make sure that their end users are adopting the Shibumi platform. Okay, so since I just taught you about ADKAR and showed a couple examples of how it can be used, we're going to pause for another poll question and ask, at which ADKAR phase do you feel that your organization most often struggles to make progress? And we'll pause here for a couple minutes again and give everyone a chance to respond to the poll.
Okay, so far it looks like we have responses in awareness. 66% say awareness, 75% say awareness, and the other one is reinforcement.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, I would say if most of the struggle seems to be in the awareness stage, like I said, these are building blocks, right? So they're kind of meant to go in order and build upon each other. So, what this framework says is that if you don't succeed in making people aware, then you're likely not going to be able to succeed in, appealing to their desire and providing them with the knowledge, etc. So I think it's just a good thing for people to kind of think about, right? When they're implementing any sort of change, is that awareness piece is really key to be able to then move on to all the rest of the building blocks and the steps here to make sure that change is successful. So thanks for your responses there. All right, we're gonna continue moving through the stages. So the build stage is really taking that communication and training plan and actually building out materials or assets. So this is an asset repository that, again, we at Shibumi, have developed and work with our customers to roll out for their implementations of Shibumi. So this really aligns to the communication and training plan that I showed earlier. Again, won't go through every single line item, but there are some common communication materials that, any transformation program can really benefit from to provide that awareness, that desire to the people who are going to be impacted. And then from a training perspective, it's always important to consider the different groups of people and how they need to be trained. So initiative team member, for example, from Acme Corp might need to be trained very differently than like an executive who is maybe only consuming reports out of a system, for example, whereas an initiative team member might be a more on the ground person who's like in the day-to-day nitty-gritty, providing data and providing information. Those trainings would need to look very different. So again, just tying back to the change impact assessment, that's why that's so important, to help you map out what do each of these impacted stakeholder groups need from a training and communication perspective, and then building your materials appropriately. Okay, after you build your materials, you'll move into execution, and actually build and execute might kind of overlap a bit because you can build some things, roll them out, build some more things, roll them out. So it doesn't have to necessarily be like waterfall here. You can be a bit more agile. But what's really important for execution is that your change management timeline, so all these stages that I've walked through, really need to align to the overall delivery of whatever it is that your project is focused on. So it doesn't make sense to communicate too far ahead, for example, if the change isn't really going to start impacting people until a way later date, because then they'll just start forgetting about it, or they won't, have that sense of urgency. So this is actually, building out this timeline is something that you should actually likely do earlier on. I'm just showing it here as an example of, when you are executing, what that timeline may look like. But aligning it to your delivery timeline is a key piece. And then lastly, we have our reinforcement stage. So just a couple of more specifics here around, what this typically entails. So 3 main things: monitoring, rewarding, and continuously improving. For monitoring, that's where you want to make sure to put feedback loops in place to obtain feedback from the people that are impacted and be tracking those adoption KPIs. Rewarding, to make people, feel a sense of accomplishment and belonging in the change that's taken place. You want to make sure to celebrate wins, provide recognition, and also share success stories, especially if you have a program that's going to be, long lasting, or a project whose timeline is kind of extensive. Sharing those success stories along the way, gives people that kind of, boost and effort to keep going for however long it's going to be. And then continuously improving. So using that feedback, using those adoption metrics to adjust your change management strategies moving forward, and putting plans in place to, keep things going from a reinforcement perspective. So whether that's doing refreshed trainings, whether that's doing additional feedback sessions, but just like you planned your entire change management journey up until launch, you should have a plan for after launch as well, and to really put that reinforcement in place. Okay, so that's all that I have for walking through the change management strategy and how to execute it. I hope that was helpful. And, definitely if there's any questions, if you want to talk specifically about your organization, whether it's relevant to implementing Shibumi or just your transformation efforts as a whole, always happy to chat in more detail. My LinkedIn is here. And I think now we'll open it up for a couple questions.
Yes, it looks like we have 2 so far. The first one is, hello, is this content related to using Shibumi software?
Yes, so this is relevant to using Shibumi software. So everything that I walked through today, the change management approach, the strategies, the workshops, the materials, are all pieces that we have developed and can provide to our customers as they're implementing Shibumi. But it's also relevant really for any change that you're implementing, in terms of, putting up a plan and a strategy in place to make sure those changes are successful. So I hope that answers that question.
Awesome. And then the second question is, will we be able to send this deck out after the webinar? I think a lot of people found this super helpful. So I think if this is able to be shared out, I think that'd definitely be great.
Great.
And then it looks like we have a couple more. How do you measure the effectiveness of change management strategies?
Yeah, so great question. I mentioned a couple of times throughout the session today, KPIs, right? So you should kind of identify your KPIs that you want to measure to gauge readiness for change and also the effectiveness of your change management strategies. So there's a lot of different KPIs that you can use for that. I'll just kind of, run through a couple that I can think off the top of my head. Some of those KPIs might be, employee readiness assessments or employee engagement results. Those can often be measured through surveys that you might send out relevant to, the project or the transformation effort that you're undertaking. Another really common one that I've seen is adherence to timeline. So that can be another key indicator that change was effective. As I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, a lot of times if change isn't managed, then it results in, rework, redoing, which all kind of ties back to timeline. If you're implementing a system, usage and utilization reports. So, seeing how the usage is looking. And there can also be softer measurements as well. So those were all kind of harder examples of KPIs, but there might just be like general observations of behavior change. And then I guess to wrap up my answer to this question, ultimately, change management success, I think, is really shown by the overall success of the project, right? So if you were able to see that benefit realization or ROI that you were looking to achieve, then, I think that shows that change management was successful.
Awesome. Thank you. And then one last question is, do you have any tips to ensure sustained adoption and engagement in change management processes, among all levels of an organization?
Yeah, another really good question. So I would say, I talked a couple of times about the reinforcement stage. So this is a really key element for sustained adoption and engagement, and having a plan in place to sustain the change long term. So, just like you would have a plan for managing the initial change, having a plan to manage the change over time through ongoing training, regular feedback sessions, and then I think this ties back to the KPIs that I mentioned as well, setting those KPIs to track progress so that you know when you need to adjust, in that reinforcement phase.
Awesome. I think that is it. If we missed any more questions, please reach out to Melody and or reach out to me, and keep an eye out for future webinars. And thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Melody.
Thanks, everyone.